Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Friday, July 24th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, it's easy to focus on the latest workforce rule or executive action, but taken together, these changes raise a larger question. What's the right balance between holding employees accountable and helping them perform at their best? Plus, what if military readiness starts at the kitchen table? A new survey of more than 10,000 military and veteran families finds that family well-being, financial stability, healthcare access, and spouse employment are deeply connected and deeply tied to readiness. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. The Merit Systems Protection Board is no longer describing itself as independent. In recent weeks, the board has been removing the word independent from its public-facing materials. The action has raised questions of confidence in other MSPB processes. And here with more details is Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Drew, thanks for joining me this morning.
Thanks for having me, Terry.
This is really fascinating. Why does the MSPB say it's making this change?
Well, we heard from an MSPB spokesperson who said that the word independent is being taken down in light of the Supreme Court decision in Trump versus Slaughter. So what happened there was that President Trump fired the head of the FTC last year without giving a reason, despite a provision of federal law that requires a reason to fire the heads of an independent agency. So that ultimately led to the Supreme Court decision where they ruled that in favor of Trump's decision there, and that essentially expanded the president's powers to fire the heads of independent agencies. Even though it was dealing with the FTC specifically, it applies to other agencies, including the Merit Systems Protection Board here. Trump also notably fired the MSPB leader, Kathy Harris, last year. That case was later dismissed from the Supreme Court, but definitely a pattern here. And now something where we're seeing this impact MSPB's description as well.
It sounds like it's more than just removing a word, though. Where have you seen the lack of independence appear in other ways for MSPB?
Well, there's been definitely a lot of changes that the MSPB has been making. So, for example, they in March had a decision where they are kind of letting, they say that they don't have jurisdiction to intervene in agency firing decisions if those cite constitutional authority. We also saw New York Times reporting later that the White House was heavily involved in conversations leading up to that decision from MSPB. So that's one example where they're essentially taking away authority or jurisdiction from themselves. But we've also seen just the simple lack of independence in the word sense on MSPB's website, in job postings. So on USA Jobs, they are not using that word anymore, and now instead just describing themselves as a quasi-judicial agency. So that's just a clear signal that this is going to be a recurring pattern for the board.
This really sparked some pretty quick reaction. What have you heard out there?
I did speak with Ray Limon, who was a former MSPB member last year who retired in February 2025. He raised, of course, a lot of concerns about what this would mean for the MSPB and just looking more broadly at how they've changed a lot of their regulatory processes. He says that this is likely going to erode federal employees' confidence in being able to use MSPB's appeals processes without any interference or having that true independence. I will say that the MSPB spokesperson does say the board's adjudicatory functions are not changed because of the removal of the word independence, and then it's only to do with leadership. But I think there are definitely broader concerns that this is going to change how federal employees interact with the board, and just a question of, what this is going to mean in the long term for MSPB as well.
And how does this fit with some of the other changes that MSPB has been making over the past few months?
There's been a lot of changes and even more coming up as well. But the most recent one we saw was that the MSPB issued joint regulations with the Office of Personnel Management in June, where they're looking to overhaul what's called the Douglas factors, which are the procedures essentially that agencies use and factors that they have to consider when firing federal employees. So they're looking to remove those factors and make it more of a case-by-case basis. There's also been, for example, schedule policy career has affected MSPB as well. Their attorney advisors and supervisory attorney advisors have all been moved to the new schedule where they no longer have civil service protections. Those are positions that the board is also now hiring for. So that's something where, we've seen a change there as well. And again, just that March decision that I mentioned where the board was kind of removing itself from the process and agency firings that have to do with constitutional authority. That ruling is still in the works, and it's actually, we're going to see an en banc hearing this fall in an appeals court dealing with that. So more to come on that side of things, but definitely a lot of changes in terms of the regulations and processes that the board has had for essentially decades.
So does this mark kind of the culmination of all of these changes for MSPB, and now it just needs to get its processes together, or are there more fundamental changes yet to come?
There is even more coming. The Office of Personnel Management has 3 different proposed regulations that have to deal with MSPB's authority and their jurisdiction again. So what is happening there is that they're trying to move different appeals processes for federal employees if they're removed from their jobs. Typically, if a federal employee is removed for a suitability action, if they're fired while on their probationary period, or if they're removed from their job due to a reduction in force, if any employees in that situation decide or believe that they were wrongfully terminated or removed, then they have the opportunity to appeal that agency decision to MSPB currently. However, OPM's regulations, although proposed right now, are looking to remove all of those processes out of MSPB and into OPM itself. This is also something that has raised a lot of flags about just independence and having employees have a fair process there. And if they do decide to appeal, again, that's all coming down the pipeline still, but something that has raised a lot of concerns for sure.
It sounds like as they move in that direction, there really won't be much work left for MSPB to do.
It's definitely going to be a much narrower authority for them. That's something that James Woodruff, who's Trump's nominee for the MSPB chairman, he said that in his nomination hearing that MSPB's jurisdiction is relatively narrow, and that's his view of things. So I would think that this is all kind of aligning, and we're going to see this all kind of come together likely in the next several months.
That's Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Drew, thanks for this story.
Thank you.
You can find her story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, it's easy to focus on the latest workforce rule or executive action, but taken together, these actions raise a larger question. What's the right balance between holding employees accountable and helping them perform at their best? This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network.
Print servers in federal environments create risk and unnecessary complexity. Every new printer, location, or policy adds strain to infrastructure that was never built for today's demands. FedRAMP High Authorized Printer Logic eliminates print servers with a secure cloud-native, zero-trust solution designed for federal IT. With advanced security, centralized control, and simplified management, agencies can modernize print without added burden. See what secure serverless printing looks like. Visit Vasion.com to learn more.
Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. The administration says recent personnel changes are intended to make government more effective and improve accountability. But as agencies move from policy announcements to implementation, questions remain about consistency, fairness, and the day-to-day realities facing the managers and employees who make government work. John Hatton of NARF joins me to help us see the forest and not just the trees. John, it's great to see you. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me once again.
There have been a lot of new rules from OPM over the past several weeks, and we can talk about each one of them specifically. But before we do that, I want to step back and have you help us get a forest level view of what's going on here. Are we seeing the emergence, do you think, of a new federal personnel management model, one that maybe gives managers more discretion?
Yes, we certainly are. I think there's been pushes from a wide variety of good government groups for improvements in how performance management works, how the government operates for a long time. And so you have at least a recognition that there could be some more expedited review, improved performance management. So a lot of these actions do put a little more power in the hands of the managers, but there's also this underlying concern around just the basic merit-based principles and whether it shifts the power so much that it's not just in the manager's hands, but it's in political appointee hands in the sense of firing people not because of their merit and because of politics, right? And so I think trying to parse through the details of the various new proposed rules and deciding, is this something that is undermining merit system principles, or is this just an expedited, consolidated, improving the efficiency of the merit system? I think are kind of how we try to take a look at this. But there are some, for example, in this new promoting employee accountability rule, trying to lessen the time for review, a shorter time window for improving performance. I think when you talk about a 1-day response window, it starts to seem very accelerated versus just an accelerated process a little bit more than it was. And so I think it's going to be a complicated new system in terms of what the new rules are for both employees and supervisors to understand and how they apply it. I think there's a trend here about taking essentially real independent review out of the process. So whether that's schedule policy career, you don't have an appeal to the Merit System Protection Board. There's a trend towards eliminating removal for cause protections for MSPB members with the previous firing in the MSPB board, the Supreme Court case in Slaughter in terms of the ability of the president to terminate a federal trade commissioner. You have the suitability and fitness rule, which allows appeals to OPM, not MSPB, for in-service conduct now. That used to be a pre-employment screening. Schedule policy career itself is just an intra-agency process. So the lack of independent review is overall our largest concern with these. The goal to try to improve accountability, improve performance, improve the way the government is working. I think there's aspects to some of these that are reasonable within the scope of what good government groups might consider, but I think it's hard to trust it when you have this underlying lack of independence, underlying lack of respect for the merit-based civil service.
A lot of the conversations about these rules focus on the implementation from the employee perspective, but I want to ask you to think about the implementation from the manager's perspective. OPM has argued that the separation practices were so complicated that managers wouldn't even tackle them. So do you think that these new rules, if they move forward, will actually make it easier for managers and HR offices to address performance problems?
I think they will have less constraints that may lead to more arbitrary standards across the government. So the new proposed rule on employee accountability gets rid of the Douglas factors, which try to create at least a standard to measure all different employment actions. So one termination at one agency or within an agency is the same as another termination within an agency or across agencies. Now they're trying to move to totality of the circumstances. So in one side of things, you can kind of make up any reason for termination outside prohibited personnel practices. On the other hand, you don't really have guidance as a manager as to kind of what's going to be okay and what's not. So I think that may lead to lack of uniformity and discipline. And I think that causes some problems. Now, will this, I think, potentially allow managers to move forward with whatever they think is the right decision and they want to fire somebody? Perhaps. But again, the lack of check on, is this based on merit or favoritism? Is this based on politics or merit? Those types of things. Is this, one supervisor being pretty trigger happy versus another, and then two different employees in similar situations are not treated the same? But yeah, so it'll be interesting to see how it, if this fully goes into effect, how it plays out. There is at least some direction for training in this employee accountability rule. So that's a positive. If you're going to change the system, you do need to train managers on how to use it and how to do performance management and review.
John Hatton is Staff Vice President at the National Active and Retired Federal Employees Association. John, let's pull that training thread just a bit more. It's been a long-standing complaint that federal managers don't get enough training in personnel management and performance management. What would NARF be looking for here to make sure that the training that's going to follow these rules is useful and effective?
Yeah, I think we'd be looking for a little bit more guidance in terms of the standards, a little bit more guidance in terms of making sure you're treating everybody based on merit. So, at the training level, I think maybe you can try to instill some of that culture of preserving the merit-based civil service. I think just learning any new rule and kind of what can I do now, what can I not do before, I think is always going to be helpful. So I think both training on the changes in rules, one, and training on just how to be a better manager and make sure you're focusing on performance and you're not just focusing on your non-management role, but you're really taking the time to work with people in a way that you're in partnership with your employees to fulfill the mission.
And from the employee perspective, trying to make sense of all these changes, what are the specific protections or rights or procedures that folks should be paying close attention to over the next few months?
Well, so one of the biggest, there's a few changes I think that really stand out, where there's the scheduled policy career where you're moved, potentially reclassified into this new accepted service system where you don't have this appeal to the Merit System Protection Board, certainly a concern. You have the non-disclosure agreement that could come out that you'll be asked to sign. That's paired with that suitability and fitness rule. So if you decide not to sign the non-disclosure agreement, are you determined unsuitable or unfit to hold office? And so that then threatens for an agency referral to OPM to then say you're removed from service based on that, and it has nothing to do with performance. So they are really creating an entire framework around their system of recentering the presidency, this unitary executive theory, and undermining kind of what were laws from Congress dictating this, some protections for employees to ensure a merit system remained intact.
Are you expecting that the real understanding of how all of these pieces fit together is going to require or rely on the outcome of some court cases?
Oh, it certainly will. I mean, the scheduled policy career is being challenged in court, including by NARF and other entities. There are going to be challenges on a lot of these rules, either because of the process or because of their consistency with the Civil Service Reform Act. And so, where this lands at the end of the day is certainly uncertain. At some point, Congress could step in. I don't anticipate that between now and the end of the year, but we could have a different looking Congress next year, and there could be efforts to put some checks on this. Court cases are certainly relevant. It's not just are the correct procedures being taken here pursuant to the Administrative Procedures Act. It's not just does this conform with the Civil Service Reform Act, but we're seeing the Trump administration make arguments on constitutional grounds. We saw them on day one say all these laws regarding this senior executive service, where we have to have removal for cause, they are unconstitutional and they impede our Article 2 authority. So they made that argument in the Slaughter case of the Supreme Court that they could fire the Federal Trade Commissioner. Whether that same precedent applies to the MSPB heads remains undetermined, and how far that goes down the chain to inferior officers as well remains undetermined. So there's a lot of uncertainty in the court cases, uncertainty with legislation. And so, this may be something people need to learn for 6 months and then remember the old system, or it could be a mixture of the two. And, I think we're seeing this across the board, not just with federal workforce policies, but as we've always had more partisanship in DC, it's really grown since, I think, early 90s, and bigger swings between the parties. I think you're seeing much bigger swings in policy. And so this could be the framework we have for the current Trump administration. But if there's a new administration that comes in, it could be a whole different set of policies, whether that's back to square one and the old policies or somewhere in the middle also remains to be seen. But I think it just, that aspect of it with, the swings in policy created by the partisanship and the different views on how things should work just creates more confusion, more difficulty, and its own set of challenges beyond the challenges of a specific policy.
John Hatton is Staff Vice President at the National Active and Retired Federal Employees Association. John, I really do appreciate your view of the forest and not just the trees today. Thanks so much.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Hear the Federal Drive on demand. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, Supreme Court justices are accustomed to hearing arguments, not making them before Congress. And recently, 2 justices went to Capitol Hill to make the case for more security funding. But first, what if military readiness starts at the kitchen table? A new survey of more than 10,000 military and veteran families finds that family well-being, financial stability, healthcare access, and spouse employment are deeply connected and directly tied to readiness. You're listening to The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. For years, policymakers have looked at military family issues through separate lenses: housing, employment, healthcare, or mental health. But a new study suggests families experience those challenges as an integrated whole. And when those pressures build, the consequences extend beyond the household and into military readiness itself. Here to walk through the details is Gabby Lesperance, Vice President of Research and Evaluation at the Military Family Advisory Network. Gabby, thank you so much for joining me today. It's great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me, Terry.
I think when people look at this report, they are going to focus on some really striking numbers around food insecurity, limited emergency savings, spouse unemployment, maybe even gaps in mental health access. You had more than 10,000 responses to your survey. When you think about all of that together, what findings surprised you most? And what do these headline numbers tell us about military family life today?
It's a great question. When we look at the data from over 10,000 respondents, it's clear that not any one finding really stands out above the rest. What we see time and time again is that all of these findings are interconnected. So military families aren't experiencing financial strain or limited healthcare access or housing burden in a silo. All of them interact and oftentimes compound with one another. When we think about food insecurity, for example, we see a spike in food insecurity immediately following a PCS. The same is true for spouse unemployment. And so when we see kind of common trends throughout our data, it helps us understand how interconnected these things are, which leads us to conversations about what solutions might come from this data and what action could be taken. And it speaks volumes to the fact that really solutions can't be one and done. We have to find interconnected solutions for military families to address the interconnected strain that they're experiencing.
Your survey was conducted at the end of calendar year 2025. That was right around the time of the longest federal lapse in appropriation. Do you think that that circumstance had any impact in the responses that you received?
It's certainly something that we need to consider when we're looking at this data. Not to say that the trends that we're seeing haven't been trends we've been tracking for some time. So it really speaks to both the current moment that military families were experiencing, including the shutdown, but also some longer term trends that we're seeing. We're seeing increasing food insecurity. We're seeing increasing housing burden. We're seeing more interest in mental health care, but difficulties with access. And those aren't standalone trends. We've seen those for a while. So it's certainly something to consider and contextualize this data, but it doesn't diminish the impact of those trend findings we've seen.
You've emphasized a couple of times here, and I want to come back to it, that military families don't experience each of these challenges in a vacuum or sequentially. And yet our system is structured to deal with them in the word that you use, silos. There's a silo for housing. There's a silo for food assistance. There's a silo for PCSs. How does the disconnect between the system and the experience affect military family life?
That's a fantastic question. What we see is repetitive patterns. And although they're not sequential in nature or siloed in their impact, what we know is that we can likely anticipate some of the things that military families may experience down the line. And that's something that we're working with in our data, is getting towards that kind of predictive understanding. But what we can tell from this survey and this single point in time is that families need increased awareness of the resources that are available. What we see time and time again is programs are beneficial. Some people are using programs, but there's a large gap in difference between need of using programs and actual use of those programs. And when we think about how we might address some of these challenges, raising awareness for things that do exist, things that are working, would help families navigate this life and some of the compounding strains that come with it.
One of the points in your recommendations is that so many of these systems, these support systems, were designed for a completely different time and generation. As you think about improving access to information, how do you connect the dots there between program design and access?
One of the things we're really intentional about measuring is generational difference among service members. Because service members aren't a monolith, their families aren't a monolith, and everyone experiences military life differently. Yes, there are patterns and commonalities, but everyone experiences different things. And so when we think about how we increase awareness, it's all about meeting generational difference where they're at. Some veterans and some folks who have been out of service for a while might want the standard communication that we've seen across military service organizations and across veteran service organizations. Whereas younger folks, the people who are in service right now or newly in service right now, want to access information differently. They want things online. They want hybrid opportunities. And so that generational focus in our data is really important. So our recommendation is always to meet service members where they are, meet the families where they are, and listen to the voice that they're expressing about how they want to learn about things so that we can share and spread awareness.
Gabby Lesperance is Vice President of Research and Evaluation at the Military Family Advisory Network. Gabby, one of the key points that this report makes over and over is that family well-being has a direct connection to readiness. Military thinking is often about readiness in terms of training and equipment and personnel availability. How are you seeing the connection between family well-being and operational readiness?
One of the key components of readiness is people. And the people managing those processes that the department cares very deeply about, as they should. Mission, it comes first. But knowing how to support the people supports readiness. And people rely on their support networks and their families to make sure that they are mission ready. And so when we think about family readiness as a crucial component to military readiness, we think back to well-being. And our report elaborates on a framework that very much starts with meeting some basic financial needs and goes all the way up through to community connection and family functioning. And when we think about strain in any one of these areas impacting the remaining areas, so too can strength. And so if we think about it as a scaffolding framework to help build families up, we can really bolster that family's well-being and ultimately military readiness at large.
Nearly half the respondents in this survey fell into what you'd call a moderate well-being category, families that are functioning but really vulnerable to any kind of disruption. How should military leaders think differently about families that aren't actually in crisis but have very little margin for error?
It's a fantastic question. So many families fall into this moderate middle that we've called it. And what this shows leaders is that although their families are functional, there is the possibility that something small can have a deteriorative effect. And so we really want to make sure that when we're thinking through things like PCS, when we're thinking through things like family support for things like spouse employment, childcare, etc., knowing that families are just on that cusp oftentimes of falling into strain and challenge should both influence how we are interacting with our service members and their families and making them aware of support resources, but also how we're leading through change. And when we think about the change that's coming and the change that's already taken place for military service members and their families, that is incredibly important.
You mentioned two issues, actually several issues, but I want to focus on two, PCS moves and childcare. They seem connected to employment disruptions, healthcare continuity, community ties. How much of what you're seeing in well-being is really downstream of a system that repeatedly asks families to start over?
so much of it is evidence of that. When we look at the number of times a family has moved, those folks who have moved less than 5 times are really struggling with the compounding impacts of a PCS, having to find new employment in new duty stations, having to find new childcare, reestablishing care with healthcare providers. Those are challenges that those families are facing. When we look to those folks who have moved 6 or more times, that strain decreases a little bit, which means that as you're going through this life, some of those challenges becomes easier to handle. And so when we're thinking about how these things compound, we really want to focus on supporting families, especially families who have moved less than 5 times, around those crucial moments so that the challenges don't cause such large impacts. Yes, we're still going to have PCS, right? Moving is a part of this life in so many ways, but helping to smooth the edges around some of those compounding factors improves well-being in the short term and would improve well-being long-term for families who have been in service longer and veterans.
If there's one lesson that policymakers should take from this report, how would you frame it? Is it that military families need more support programs, or that government needs to think differently about how they intersect and compound? Where is the key leverage point?
Military family readiness is military readiness. And when we look at it from that perspective, it just shows you how important awareness of all of these programs and support mechanisms is. When we think about reducing spouse employment, when we think about overcoming some of the challenges in a PCS, reducing childcare lack of availability, awareness of programs is crucial, but so too is reconceptualizing how we think about military readiness to include families who are supporting service members.
Gabby Lesperance is Vice President of Research and Evaluation at the Military Family Advisory Network. Gabby, thanks so much for sharing this important report with us.
Thank you, Terry.
We'll post this interview and a link to the report at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, Supreme Court justices are accustomed to hearing arguments, not making them before Congress. Recently, 2 justices went to Capitol Hill to make a case for more security funding. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. As concerns about threats against judges continue to grow, members of the Supreme Court took the unusual step of personally advocating for additional security funding on Capitol Hill. That appearance may say as much about the pressures facing the judiciary as the dollars being requested. Joining me with her perspective is Isa Ulloa, founder and CEO of the Public Service Alliance. Isa, it's lovely to have you back. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Terry. Great to see you.
I wish we had something better to talk about, though. We had the Supreme Court justices, Justice Barrett and Justice Kagan, on the Hill recently in person to make the case for millions of dollars additionally for the Supreme Court budget to cover personal and building security. Let's start with this. How unusual is it for members of the Supreme Court to show up to make these kinds of statements in person on the Hill?
Highly unusual. And in fact, this was their first in-person testimony since 2019. So it's been several years since then, obviously. But I think it's a really, stark reminder and red flag of how out of hand threats have gotten. We can talk a little bit more about how those threats have been rising since about 2013, the manner in which they are impacting every type of public servant nationwide. But the fact that we had 2 Supreme Court justices focus their testimony on the rising threats and the resources that are needed to contend with them is pretty unprecedented.
Justice Barrett herself told a couple of really interesting stories. She talked about having to explain a bulletproof vest to her 12-year-old son. And she had another child that opened the door to a swatting incident and was stunned. So clearly there's a personal impact. Do you think that these are isolated experiences? Do prominent females experience this differently than prominent males? Or what's going on here? And is this just now part of the job?
A couple things in response. So what the data does show is that women and people of color are definitely at disproportionate risk writ large. And that applies not only to very high profile public servants who happen to be women or people of color, but, all the way down to the local level, whether it's a school board official or a public school teacher. And the human costs of this are extraordinary and often tragic. You have examples of the 20-year-old son of a judge in New Jersey being murdered by someone who is seeking out the judge. You have, of course, the tragic example of Melissa Hortman and her husband last year. And then you have several swatting incidents that have impacted not only judges, but former public servants like Pete Buttigieg, who recently came out to speak about this. And what we're hearing is that parents are having to have really tough conversations that they shouldn't have to have with their kids around not only why they need protective details, why they might need to wear a bulletproof vest, but to train their children, oftentimes at ages where, there's a strong desire for obvious reasons to protect their innocence, to have to think critically like an adult around whether to answer the front door, whether to talk to a stranger. And it's very sad in terms of how the children of public servants have been targeted in ways that not only create material risk for them, but that are yielding some really significant emotional impacts.
Let's bring this back to the justices for a moment. At what point did threats like these against judges become more than a security problem and really start being a justice system problem? Are there implications for judicial independence and public confidence in the courts?
It's a big question. What we know is that violent threats against public servants, to include judges at every level, have been skyrocketing for more than 10 years at this point. And those threats manifest in several different ways: death threats, intimidating messages, cybersecurity attacks, doxing incidents, swatting incidents, and things of the like. On the one hand, there's an important conversation, I think, to be had around the role of government in responsibly creating deterrence and maintaining accountability, right? So there are dozens of civil and criminal statutes that can be used to charge people who commit certain crimes against public servants. It's important to do that in a way that is responsible, meaning that it, is not in violation of constitutionally protected rights, as an example. But bringing the charges and, if convicted is still not enough. People need to hear about it, right? And so, you'll recall at the height of the mask mandate at COVID, there were unprecedented attacks against flight attendants on several different airlines. A material driver around driving down the rate of those attacks was amplifying the fact that in many cases those attacks constituted a felony and there were real consequences for attacking folks in that manner. And so to the extent that the press in particular is able to amplify the consequences of what happens, it creates an important deterrent effect. That's number one. Number two is there is a broader kind of government-wide multi-branch conversation to be had around how to right-size security resources relative to this threat environment, because they have not been appropriately right-sized in a long time, and they certainly have not been right-sized in a way that accounts for how dynamic the current environment is, where, the proliferation of threats on social media through AI is novel, right? And so the good news is that the frameworks for how to solve this problem exist. The tougher news is that I think as a country, we've been pretty slow to the jump, and we have a lot of work to do.
Isa Ulloa is the founder and chief executive officer of the Public Service Alliance. So let's come back to that question about right sizing, because we've heard similar concerns to what Justice Kagan and Justice Barrett raised from members of Congress themselves and efforts to increase the congressional budget for protection. When Congress looks at the Supreme Court's budget request, how should they think about the return on that investment?
So look, the request in the grand scheme of things, and comparatively speaking, is not that massive, right? I mean, it's a 10%, almost 10% total increase from last year. It's under $20 million just for the additional security needs. And they're important security needs, right? It's an expansion of personal protection of the justices, not only at work, but also at home. It's around an expanded capacity for residential security. And importantly, it also includes dollars to be able to level up the cybersecurity posture of the court system nationwide. And so there's a lot of parallels between what the justices are requesting and what lawmakers have requested themselves. The important thing here is, I think, to not just appropriate more money for the sake of it. There has to be a well-informed way to, or plan rather, to implement it. And so that means, for example, ensuring that those resources are being leveraged to build in-house capacity that can more sustainably protect these officials than consistently having to outsource this expertise, which tends to be more expensive. It requires those dollars to be, or should require those dollars to be leveraged in a manner that is aligned with the expertise of actual operators, because not everybody needs necessarily to be spending $5 million a year on a security detail. Oftentimes the threats are cyclical and very kind of unique to certain individuals. But at a high level, both the judicial and the legislative branch are facing unprecedented threats, and the people responsible for keeping those folks safe need more resources to do their jobs well.
Isa, are there sort of a common set of actions that we could take that would help to address the root of these problems and maybe not just the symptoms?
Absolutely. And I'm really glad that you asked that question, because this problem is not new. We are glad to see that it is getting a lot more attention, and that attention is humanizing folks and is raising awareness not only of the problem, but also solutions. And as it relates to those solutions at PSA, there are about 6 that we feel very strongly about, and that we would characterize as pretty common sense and nonpartisan solutions. So the first is obviously to approve this request and to take it a step further and assess where else government resources need to be right-sized to deal with the current environment. And look, government has a lot of money appropriated every year. These requests are not, trillion-dollar requests. There is a way to responsibly be able to efficiently allocate, in many cases, existing resources to better protect folks so that they're not having to figure this out themselves and spend out of pocket. The second is there are decades of research around what's called a public health approach to violence prevention. We know that preventing a crisis is way less expensive, for lack of a better term, than responding to a crisis. And the public health approach to violence prevention advocates for a couple things. First are what are called behavioral threat assessment and management teams. The Secret Service actually has been documenting evidence around why these teams, the shorthand for them are BTAMs, are incredibly effective at preventing violence. And the primary reason is that most people on a pathway to violence are basically, there are predictable patterns that they tend to follow that then can, by definition, be identified in advance and prevent a tragedy before it occurs. And there are not enough BTAM teams across the country. There should be one in every major jurisdiction, and they should follow the best practices that have been documented not only by the Secret Service, but by many others. Another example of a strong public health approach to violence prevention includes funding off-ramps. So there's a group called Moonshot, for example, that has done some really interesting research about the fact that a lot of people, when they're searching for extremist content online, are more likely and more predisposed to then click on a mental health resource if it's put in front of them. And so there's an opportunity there for the technology to adapt accordingly. Similarly, with respect to social media platforms more broadly, about 6 years ago, X started testing cognitive interrupt design as a concept. And basically what they found is that when they prompted people with a question like, "Are you sure you want to post this?" depending on the content of the draft, over 30% of people revised or chose not to send what they originally wrote. Whereas from the perspective of the major LLMs and the AI chatbots and platforms, we're already seeing some really interesting integrations around things like suicide prevention. That should be extended to violence prevention. And that means that, we're not advocating in any way for these LLMs to become therapists. But if we know that people, as they are radicalizing, are predisposed to also seek out mental health support, there are ways to at least amplify awareness of resources that might be available to these individuals before they commit a crime. The third major kind of category of solutions is relevant to data privacy. It is way too easy and way too cheap to figure out where people live without their consent. And so we are very strong advocates of an expansion of New Jersey's Daniels Law nationwide. We'd like that law ultimately to be broader in scope in terms of the categories of public servants that it can cover. But importantly, it's around ensuring that not only data brokers, but public records are required to remove personal information if the individual has not provided their consent. That personal information includes things like home addresses. Hopefully, it can also include things like a private right of action so that if a data broker or a government doesn't comply, individuals have a real recourse that will make a difference. And this can be done in a way that doesn't jeopardize First Amendment principles. Those things are not mutually exclusive. The next thing that we're really focused on is just really sounding the alarm on how important it is for bipartisan leaders to come together and issue very high-profile condemnations of violence and issue very high-profile calls for civility and peaceful disagreement, because we know that this materially decreases the temperature and sets the right example. And then lastly, there are a number of organizations that are values aligned in the sense that they believe that the safety of people who serve should transcend politics. Many of those organizations are commercial companies that offer tools that are very relevant to keeping folks safe and reducing their risk. And through PSA, what we have done is build a marketplace that not only vets those tools and negotiates discounted rates to them so that they are more affordable, but enables any current or public servant to access that in a more affordable and in a faster manner. And we'd like to be able, to scale this nationwide in partnership with government agencies, quite frankly, because it shouldn't be on the individual to have to figure this out themselves. This has become basically a cost of doing business. And so there is a need for the employer to step up.
Isa Ulloa is founder and chief executive officer of the Public Service Alliance. Thanks so much for spending some time with us today, and thanks for the work you're doing here. It's so important.
Thank you, Terry. Likewise.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. The Space Force's Space Systems Command is already seeing an increase in trust and confidence when it comes to applying artificial intelligence tools to mission areas. While hard metrics may still be difficult to point to, for areas like source selection or market research, Guardians are already feeling the impact of these new and emerging capabilities. F. Schnell is Deputy Portfolio Acquisition Executive for the Space Force Infrastructure Office, and Captain Doc Reyna is the Director of Human AI Teaming Lab at Space Systems Command. They talked about it with Federal News Network's Jason Miller on our Space and Satellite Exchange. Reyna speaks first.
We are looking at AI and automation as tools to help the acquisition professionals or workforce / F's office, right? Any or other offices across Space Systems Command and Space Force as applicable. The goal is to move faster, make better use of information, reduce time spent on repetitive tasks, which AI does really well. The goal is not to replace acquisition professionals by using AI. The goal is to give them better tools so they can focus on judgment, strategy, mission needs, risk profile, delivering capability faster. As F mentioned about RFP, when looking at reviewing RFPs, etc. A lot of acquisition work involves finding information, reviewing documents, tracking requirements, previous requirements, lessons learned, understanding risk, coordinating across different offices, this is where AI and automation can really help. And they can help organize information, support market research, which is extremely important, review large amounts of text data, and identify patterns and improve knowledge management. So with that, we can do better due diligence. But the human remains central to the whole operation. The technology should support the acquisition professional, not bypass the acquisition professional. So human in the loop process. Whatever happens, human is in the loop, making the final decision. Over.
You make a really interesting point that we hear time and again: not replace, but speed up, make things better, make them understand. I think that's one of the things that I'd love to know a little more about. How are you getting guardians to trust the AI? As part of your lab, it's right. Not just I'm going to show you how to do it and look, it works, but there's a bigger piece here. Right.
So that's definitely a great question, and I have to think how much I can get deeper into it, because that may expose our TTPs, right? How we do things to business.
Yeah, we definitely don't want to expose any TTPs, but from a high level, if you're going to jump in, go ahead.
Yeah. So from a PAE office, adoption of new technology and tools is something that we've been working through for the last 30 years, really, because it's getting faster, but we've never not had a new tool. So it is really a case of putting a demand signal out there. Secretary Hegseth did that with the "I want you to use Gen AI" direction. The policy memo that we issued adds to the emphasis to start using these tools, but it's also a matter of checking in and broadcasting early wins. Like, I didn't know my cost analysts were using it until we issued the policy and said, "Tell me what wins you're doing." And they said, "Okay, here's what example. It would have taken 3 hours to do it. It took me 15 minutes, so I could go on to more work." It's not about doing away with people's job. It's I have more work than I have people to do, and now I can get into the next level of detail. So it's broadcasting the early wins and showing other people how easy it is. I have a monthly brain day where we take half a day and we work through issues that are interest to the workforce, and we broadcast this is how, Office A or B or C is using it. And if they find that useful to their task, they can go talk to that office and collaborate on challenges, workload issues. So from my perspective, it is a push along many different lines to get adoption. And it's not all a hard sell. It's not all soft. It's across the board of we're going to use it, so let's figure out how to.
So I'll jump in. Thank you for bringing your point. So in the lab, how do we trust? How do we calibrate the trust in AI responsibly? So in the lab, it is not the blind trust that an operator or guardian should do. It is our core question is, do we believe in AI? The question is, can guardians use AI the right level of trust at the right time, at the right mission decision? So HatLab answered that by evaluating AI-enabled tools in operationally relevant scenarios, I think I mentioned initially. So Guardian interact with AI recommendation, decision support tools, and simulated mission vignettes, for example, while the lab studies how this tool can affect their trust, their workload, situational awareness, decision confidence. So AI usually provide a confidence score like I'm 95% sure, so that kind of confidence, and mission effectiveness, and those are the key areas we're looking at: trust calibration, human accountability, operators workload, as I mentioned initially, decision quality of it, explainability and usability, and if possible, we would like to support governance policy eventually. Lab has a process to look at trust calibration, and we work with the operators who are working in mission set, operation relevant mission set to calibrate that trust. Hope that answers your question.
It does. I mean, I think you got to work with the users. You have to kind of show them what it can do, and not that it's going to replace them. But oh my God, this, to F's point, the cost analysts. Wait a minute, they used to take me 3 hours, and now it takes me 15 minutes. Wow, that's a huge change. And I think you have to show them, and not only does it take you 15 minutes, but the tool does it right, or is 99% right, or some sort of high percentage. Because even as humans, we'll make mistakes, we'll fat finger a keyboard or something as well. So you have to accept some sort of mistake with as long as it lowers risk.
Absolutely. Yep, you're correct. Like the way F and the team across Space Systems Command or Space Force, they're the end users, right? Somebody has to be looking at the trust piece. Is what Guardian doing the right thing to do, etc., etc. So our lab is that lab who focuses on that.
That's Doc Reyna, the Director of Human AI Teaming Lab at Space Systems Command. You also heard from F. Schnell, Deputy Portfolio Acquisition Executive for the Space Force Infrastructure Office. It was part of our Space and Satellite Exchange this week. If you missed that event, you can get caught up at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.